Hello, YouTubers, friend compatriots, losers, shows, desolate, shorts, peasants, vassals, terror fans, horror fans, eerie fans, Vampirella fans. I'm a useful idiot, and today I'm going to do a terrible report on terrorism, but I assure you it will still be terrifying in all of its terrible details. And the history of terrorism is kind of interesting, and I've always had a lot of issues thinking about terrorism. Because when you have a huge state power, as we have throughout history, and we have a struggling, ill-equipped, but enthusiastic insurrection or resistance, it seems like the development of terrorism is inevitable. And so it has a cloudy moral issue to it. Of course, the cloudy moral issues are less apparent in our own times, considering so many innocents, including women and children, and all nature of innocence are killed in the name of terrorism. But it's a long tradition that, like everything else, goes back through thousands of years of human history. And imagine the kinds of terrorism found in past centuries, just considering the brutal nature of culture as you go back through history. Roman crucifixions being a good form of state terrorism on a massive scale. And I can tell you it certainly would have worked on me. But let's go back through the history of terrorism and then kind of look at how it applies today. So terrorism dates back about 1,500 years. And the first known example that's coined as terrorism is when Jewish resistance between 66 and 72 AD against the Romans. And they were known as zealots. And they killed Roman soldiers and destroyed Roman property, and the term terrorism was coined. And this concept existed for centuries. In fact, the term assassin comes from the Shiite Muslim term for hashashins, or hashish eaters, who were fighting Sunni Muslims between 1090 and 1275. And the hashashins were known to spread terror. So interesting lineage here. Going back to Sunnis, Shiites, and Jews. So this lineage seems to stay with them to this day, going back 1,500 years. And modern terrorism essentially developed out of the French Revolution reign of terror from 1793 to 1794. And that was, like I say, state-sponsored terrorism. And this is the time that terrorism, the term, is coined, and Robespierre used terror and the guillotine to go after all his political enemies and keep people on board for his version of the revolution. And it's used to achieve political ends. That's one of the things that's notable about terrorism. As shocking and grisly and pointless as it seems, it is a political tool used for liberation, oppression, and politics. And I would argue that it's a natural outcome of the state. When you have the state grow all-powerful and use surveillance and militarization of the police, brutal oppressive tactics, and massive militaries, then certainly either a domestic audience or a foreign audience has no other alternative other than to resort to terrorism, just out of economics. And so we have the 18th century French Revolution, and then by the early 19th century we have the anarchists, the early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and this is the birth of individual terrorism, and trying to use terrorism to bring down a government. So the modern version of terrorism, as we know it, was essentially invented by anarchists of the late 19th and early 20th century. And there's other state-sponsored terrorism going on all the time, and there's so many examples I really don't have the room to talk about. That would include the Armenian genocide. But I'm going to stick to some of these more prominent examples right now. And the anarchists had quite a few successes, as it turns out. From 1890 to 1908, they killed the kings and queens of Russia, Austro-Hungary, Italy, and Portugal. And there was even an anarchist bombing on Wall Street in 1910. Worth looking at, a very interesting story. In 1901, the assassination of President McKinley in the United States was credited to anarchists, and 1914, this is very important, anarchists claimed responsibility for shooting the Archduke Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary, which arguably set off the fuse that began World War I. So these terrorists obviously can have a huge effect on events, and we see that throughout history, and we see it in our own time. And then to go back to the historical timeline, then in the 20th century, the Russian Revolution of 1917-1918, government-sponsored terrorism comes back, just as we'd seen before during the French Revolution. And it was used, government-sponsored terrorism, using to eliminate enemies and to get the population in line. Then in the 1920s, we had the Irish Rebellion and the noted Irish terrorism. And, one might even credit the Irish for creating all the noteworthy characteristics of modern terrorism. And part of that is selective terrorism against specific targets and sustained terrorism over a number of years and even decades. And they also use cell operations, so that there will always be operatives in the field working independently. It could not be captured just by capturing one cell. And so we see this flip-flopping between state-sponsored terrorism and individual terrorism, and that marks our time, certainly, and is also notable throughout history. And then during the middle 20th century, all during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and well into the 70s, we have terror used all over the post-colonial world, and actually at that time a lot of the world that was still colonial. To have insurrections in all these areas of Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Central America, and we're still dealing with the repercussions to this day. And not surprising that terrorism and these selective acts of violence would be used for political means all throughout those regions. And like I say, the same techniques being used every day. And by the 50s and 60s, everything, of course, had changed. And then we move into the Middle East Cold War eras. And also notable, too, as far as terrorism, is that during the 1940s, and when the Zionists basically were taking over Palestine, leaders of the Zionist movement even boasted of being the grandfathers of terrorism because they utilized those techniques themselves against the Palestinians in order to take over the country of Israel and take a greater portion of that. But that's a story for another day as well. So by the 1960s, 50s and 60s, we have the Cold War in the Middle East, violence escalating, and this is what an era that's noted by the internationalization of terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism. So we have countries like China and Russia and, well, as certainly the United States as well, but countries all over the world sending proxies and having proxy wars all over the world. So quite a cataclysm of terrorism, as I remember well, in the 60s and 70s, because, like I say, it was being used in all the post-colonial countries and all the colonial countries, and it was being used in all the proxy wars, and certainly in the Middle East, and all the clashes all over the globe. And the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Army organization, was the notable terrorist group when I was growing up, and I remember hijackings and killings and explosions all the time. So I'm very, very familiar with terrorism, and I do not have any warm, fuzzy feelings towards terrorism and that method. Let me assure everyone. And I have no sympathy for Islamists who use this tactic. And certainly the most brutal example I can think of was the 1970 Munich Olympics, when terrorists from the PLO slaughtered innocent Israeli athletes. And this just kind of behavior is pretty despicable. But the world of terrorism also gets cloudy because we have operations where Western governments in the United States and in Europe have things like Operation Gladio, where they actually have terrorist operations that they use on their own populations and all over the world in order to perpetrate their own political agendas, blaming it on their enemies. So we have a lot of false flag terrorism, and then we have all the mix-ups and confusion we have in the world today as the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia ends up fighting Al-Qaeda and bankrolling them in other situations, and this is just how it goes. So there's terrorism. Everybody has their hands in this cookie jar. No one is innocent, and everyone has to share the blame. And the 1970s also brought the one of the most striking characteristics we see of modern terrorism, and that's militant Islam and using religious-based terrorism. And that's relatively new, and that's a result of the Afghan war and the radicalization of militants. But its roots go further back, and once again, everyone has their hands in the cookie jar as far as Russia and Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Pakistan, and everyone else, Iran, creating a lot of the groundwork necessary to have all this religious-based terrorism. And in our modern age, we're marked by terrorism nearly every day in countries all over the world. So we live in a global world of terrorism now, and certainly this has to be a culmination of anything that, unlike anything we've ever seen, because there literally is terrorism all across literally every country in Asia. There's terrorist strikes in Russia, in the Chechenian situation. We have all the terrorist strikes in the Middle East, in Iraq every single day, in Syria every single day, in places across Africa every day, in places across Latin America every day, in places Mexico every day, and now theoretically we have terrorist activities within the United States, and this is just the world of terrorism, and every opposition group now can be characterized as a terrorist. And that's another symptom of our age, is that all states will now characterize everything as terrorist so they can use circumvent all laws in order to fight this new war. So that is another characteristic of our modern age of terrorism. And so democracy is being suspended in the name of terrorism. So the bigger part of this agenda is something I've talked about many times. So anyway, for now, it looks like terrorism has won, because we have become the enemy and sacrificed all our freedoms for security that we will never have. And so there's a little glimpse of terrorism. Not a great tactic, but an inevitable tactic, and its history shows that it's been with us for a very, very, very long time, and it will continue to be with us for a very, very, very long time. I'm Useful Idiot. Don't you be one too.